Welcome. I hope everybody is fast asleep after lunch. So let's talk about OpenAPI and Perl and Koha and stuff like that. My name is Thomas Klausner, or Dom. I'm doing Perl for like 25 years or something. That's my 19th European Perl conference, but it's my first KohaCon, so it's always nice to learn something new. I'm actually here also as the K in HSK3, which is us three guys, Mark Hofstetter, David Schmidt, and me. Some of the Koha guys maybe know Mark Hofstetter from the hackathon in Marseille. We have this small website because via some weird accident we start to work with Koha in 2020 because the Steiermärkische Landesbibliothek, so one big library in Austria, wanted to migrate to Koha, and we were like Perl developers, and somehow we ended up migrating them to Koha. And since then, we've worked with a lot of other smaller libraries in Austria, Germany, and one in Hungary, helping with migrations, hosting Koha a little bit, and providing custom development with Koha. So we are starting to enter the Koha place a little bit, coming from a Perl background. This talk is going to be about OpenAPI or Swagger. Short introduction to the OpenAPI specification. The spec, formerly known as Swagger. I think Swagger is a really stupid name, and I'm very glad that they moved to the nicer name OpenAPI. It's going to be a little bit of Perl code and also some Koha. Okay, so OpenAPI, that's the web page. That's the other web page because there's still duplicate for some reasons. I don't know who of you is old enough to know SOAP. Probably everybody. Yeah, yeah, we all love SOAP. And OpenAPI is a little bit like SOAP if you replace the XML with YAML. Okay. Is that progress? I don't know. It's definitely progress because you don't have to look at the XML anymore. So that's progress. But still, basically, it's a specification language that provides a standardized means to define your API to others. That's from the OpenAPI web page. And then you can quickly discover how an API works, configure infrastructure, generate client code, create tests, case for your APIs, and do a lot of things. So that's the claim of their web page. So let's take a look at a very simple API specification, in that case in YAML. So you have to specify what version you're using. In that case, that's the newest version, so OpenAPI 3.1. Then you have some metadata, like what's the name of the API, some description, the version of your API. And then it starts to get interesting. You can define paths, so like the endpoints of your API. In that example, you have like a path /board. And in here, you define what the get method to this path should look like. Oops. Yeah, it's getting a bit long. So you have a summary and description, and you can add some helpful text. And then like the automatically interesting part, for example, here you say, okay, this thing has some responses, and there's the 200 status code, which the description okay is not very interesting, but whatever. And this thing returns something, returns content, and the content is in, if it's application JSON, then you can define a schema. So how does the return value or whatever this API call returns looks like? In that case, it's an object, so you're not getting like one string back, you're getting a whole object back, and the object has some properties. For example, it has a winner and a board. And then you can again define how these properties look like. In that case, for example, the winner is of a type string, and it is an enum, so it can be a dot, a x, or a 0, because it's a tic-tac-toe game. Or you have like the board, for example, is of type array, so it's not like a simple type, it's a more complex type. Again, you can say, okay, is that min items, max items, so this thing is an array which always has 3 items, and the items are another array, which again has 3 items, and then in the end you have this enum thing. So you get, if you call that, you would get something back like that. So again, 200 okay, it's content type application JSON, and you have the winner is dot, so there is no winner yet, and here's the dump of the board, which is this 2-dimensional array with 3 values each. So one very nice thing I use a lot is to render the specification as documentation. There are a lot of tools available to render this YAML because you can read it, but it's more machine readable than human readable. There's, for example, there are like millions of tools. This one is you can run locally via Docker, which then looks like this. So you get a nice view of the documentation. GitLab has a nice hidden feature that I discovered by accident. If you have a file name that contains OpenAPI and is YAML, then it renders the specification like that. There's a very small, not really demo. So this is one GitLab instance and one of those files, which is just like it has the magic OpenAPI in the file name. And then you can see all of the requests that are available, and you can click on them and inspect them and figure out what's happening. Which is quite helpful. There are a lot of theoretical benefits to OpenAPI which I have never used yet. For example, to generate tests. When you have the specification, you can just use this thing because it's machine readable code to generate your test cases. You can generate client or server code or both. So if you get an OpenAPI specification from somebody else, there are tools in Perl or in any other language which you can use to just generate a client for it. And then you don't have to do all of the boring stuff. Same for the server side. You could create, for example, TypeScript classes automatically and then use them in your JavaScript code, and a lot of possibilities which I have never used yet. So, but I guess, people use them. The most common features that used by me is, for one, defining parameters, because like one thing that's really great about this is that you can take this back, send it to your front-end developers, and they can read it and discuss it, and you don't have to implement everything beforehand or the other way around. So what arguments does an API endpoint take, and how shall I pass them? So that's another thing that you can define in this API spec, which surprisingly is called parameters. You can have the name of the parameter and where it is. So in that case, the name is ID, and the parameter is located in the path, which you see over there in these curly brackets. You can say, is it required or not or whatever, and then you can also continue to further define the schema to say, okay, it has to be an integer between 1 and 100. What's maybe interesting, which I didn't mention earlier, is most of this stuff is optional. Yes, you can start very small, just define the path, and then define the parameters, and then define the schema for one parameter, and then continue until you have a 5,000 line long YAML file and are back in the SOAP world. So it would look like that. Or you can have another parameter named detail, which is in the query. You can again define a schema, it's a string, it's an enum, those values are allowed. And then you would just use it like question mark, parameter name equals whatever. You can also get parameters from headers and from cookies and from some other places, so that's quite nice to define all of those things. You can also define an incoming payload. Like most REST APIs take a whole JSON document and usually don't take like request parameters because you have like a lot of data. Like this, so when you do a curl request using -d for the data and then you pass in some JSON payload. You can specify this like this. In OpenAPI, they changed it a little bit compared to Swagger. Now it's have this thing called request body, where you define how the request body looks like. You say, okay, you have to have a request body, so you cannot just send an empty request. You define the content. In that case, okay, if it's application JSON, it's an object with some properties. For example, an email and a username, and then you can say, okay, required is the email. It's not 100% consistent. Sometimes you have to say required inside, like you've seen earlier in the list of the properties, and sometimes you have to define it externally, but it sort of makes sense anyway. So for this endpoint, you can have a curl request like that, where you just post to some user 42 the payload with this stuff. The other thing I'm using most of the time is defining response data. We've seen it a little bit. So you see, okay, this is the response for the status code 200, content application, schema, whatever. So if you call this, you get this back. Of course, you can not only define like the 200 success code, you can also define errors, like different for each different status code. You can define your what this error looks like or that error looks like. Or you can go crazy here. And you can also have different content types. For example, if you have like proper content negotiation, in your REST API, you can say, okay, I can return this JSON document, this XML document, and this plain HTML document. But I would try to not go crazy and somehow stay pragmatic with that, because it's like. So let's say you have a pager, something like that, where you have like a page parameter and an items parameter. So you want to get 25 items of the third page of this search result. You would define it like that. You have the parameters in the query. One is the name, one is the page, and the other is the items. Both are integers. Very simple. But then you have another endpoint where you also have a pager, and you have another endpoint where you also have a pager. So try, don't repeat yourself, also applies to this JSON schema thing, because you don't want to like copy and paste all of this over the place. So there's something called components and this magic thing called $ref. Components is another section in this schema document where you can define, for example, parameters. So you define how the page parameter look like. It's basically the same as we've seen before. There's a name and where it's located. The same for the items. And then you can, because now you can add maybe more data to it, because you don't have to specify it in 20 places, but it's like moved into one place, so you can have the description and you can fine tune the definition. And then in the GET request, where you use it, instead of explicitly listing all of those big code blocks, you can replace them with a reference into this other component schema. Okay? So instead of defining it in here, you define it in the components set, and then you just say, okay, this is a reference to this place. Yeah. Like here, color coded. And then you can do this for users, and you can do it for groups, and yeah, less code, less typos, less errors. Yeah. Don't repeat yourself. And you can, of course, do this also for other things, for example, for the schemas, like for the response data that you send out. So here there's some response that returns an email and a user name and a lot of more fields. That's the GET request. And the POST request maybe returns the same data. So instead of defining it 2 times, one for the GET request and one for the POST request, you put this thing into the schema, define the object there, and then in those specifications, you just say, okay, this uses this schema and that schema, the same schema in that case. So this weird ref thingy, the value of this ref thing is actually a URI. In that case, it's a fragment, you know, when you have like a hash sign for an internal link in a web page. So this definition is loaded from the current file where we're using it. But you can also use relative and absolute paths, or even load schema definitions like to other files on the same server, or you can load them from completely external sources from the web. There's this other thing called JSON schema, which is somehow related to OpenAPI. JSON schema is a definition schema for any JSON data, not just for APIs. Okay. For example, if you work with Kubernetes has a lot of objects. Okay, Kubernetes also has a REST API, but the definition of all of those objects, they have a schema for it, so you can verify that whatever you have on in your Helm charts is actually correct and valid JSON. And you can also use the JSON schema stuff with the OpenAPI and with other tools. So a schema, okay, it looks like that. In that case, now it's not YAML, now it's JSON. But OpenAPI you can have the specification in both YAML or JSON, doesn't care. But that's JSON. So this basically looks the same as we've seen before, but now with more quotes and curlies, which I like more actually, because I don't like meaningful white space, which get lost all the time. I like to have my curlies, where I can jump around in Vim and stuff. Anyway, so you have your object, which is the same as we've seen before. What's new here is that in this JSON schema file, you can specify which schema you're using to define the schema, because of course the schema has versions, and when a new version comes out, they have new features or things that deprecated. So you should say, okay, this file uses that schema. So we are now highly entering the SOAP and XML area again. Everything moves in cycles. And the other thing is you give this thing an ID. So that's the unique identifier of that schema that's hosted at some place. And if you want to use this in your OpenAPI specification, you just first define the schema component. So you go to component schemas, as we have seen before. And instead of defining your schema inline in your file, you just say, again, $ref, and reference, for example, an external URI where your schema is hosted. And then you just use the schema component in your spec as before. So that's some sort of one step of indirection that's needed here. Yeah, so schema validation. So OpenAPI, as I said earlier, provides a lot of tools to validate your payload via an HTTP, etc., via an HTTP API, but not everything is an HTTP API. You use your data in other contexts. Yes, you have cron jobs, fix-up scripts, migrations, importers, whatever, and they have data and they import and export data. So I think it's nice to have your OpenAPI specification, but I think it's nicer to define like your objects in JSON schema, use the schema definitions in your API, and then you can also use the same schema definitions in completely other contexts that are not related to HTTP REST APIs. I mean, you can also go crazy and use the schema verification in method calls, so that when your method takes some input, and then you can verify if your parameters match the schema. But then you could also write, I don't know, Rust or Go or some other strongly typed code. There's one, I mean, like several modules, that's the one I like most. I can turn this bigger again, sorry. JSON validator. Okay, I'll turn it smaller again. Which is like a SQL model, you just use it, you initiate an object of it, and then you can have, for example, that's a method that you would write to validate your data versus a schema. So you just tell the JSON validator what schema you're using, which could be this file. It can load local files, strings, and external URLs. That's quite nice. And then you validate your data against the schema. If it's not valid, it will return some errors. If you have some errors, you maybe want to throw an exception, or I don't know, report the user, yeah, do whatever you want. For example, attention error. For example, here I just stringify all of the errors that I get back from the schema validation to a string and report it as an exception. And then I have some other handlers that make a nice user-readable error message out of that exception object. And if you don't have any errors, you can return, for example, true and say, okay, everything is fine, the data is correct. Please proceed and store the data in the database or do whatever. And that's, for example, how an error would look like. So that's the output of JSON validator saying, okay, you're missing the required property title. And you passed the description, but it accepted a string, but it got null because you just provided an empty string or something like that. And of course, depending on your schema definition and whatever data you pass, you get different kind of exceptions. But it's the nice thing is that it basically analyzes your whole document and tells you in one go all of the problems that this file or this data has with your schema. And then you can, I don't know, tell the stupid users to fix their data, or maybe you have to fix something on your part. Okay, there are some advanced features, well, sort of advanced features of JSON schema, which is also available in OpenAPI. So here you have a schema where you define a dog and a cat. They have different properties, but whatever you want to use can use either a dog or a cat because it's a pet shop or something. I don't know. You don't care, but they are like different. So you can endpoint can take either a dog or a cat. Then you can use one of. Oops, to say, okay, in this place, you can either take this schema or that schema. And if you use it like that, then the validator will basically say, okay, do the properties have bark and breed? Okay, then it's a dog. Do the properties have hunts and age? Then it's a cat. And if they have like a different set of properties, it will say no, invalid object, which is a little bit messy. So you can add a hint to make the type clearer, which is called discriminator, where you define which property discriminates the object. So in that case, you would add to your schema definition a third property type, which would contain, for example, dog and cat, depending on what it is. And then it's nicer and just a little bit more stable for the validation thing to figure out what it is, because it doesn't have to guess, and depending on your schema, it might be hard to auto-guess and stuff like that. And it also makes the documentation much nicer. Yeah, so basically that's polymorphism implemented in this JSON schema thing. And if you just take a quick look, for example, here, where you see you have, so this thing returns either a login object, a participation object, or an error object. So it's one of those, and then you can actually take a look at what it is. And yeah, just see what it is. Another nice thing is all of. So sometimes you have like an error that consists of an error code and an error message. Okay, fine enough. But then you have an authentication error that adds another field. You also want to have the reason why the user is not authorized. And then you have a not found error where you maybe want to report a resource that's not found. So again, you're seeing a lot of duplicate code here, which is annoying. So you can use all of, which basically includes, it's like an include or something, one definition into another. So the auth error consists of all of the fields from the generic error plus the reason. So that's another nice way to reduce the amount of duplicate code you have in your schema definitions. Okay, next topic, OpenAPI and Koha. I think in 1911 it was introduced. Is that correct? That was like the first documentation I could find. So Koha now uses an API specified and using OpenAPI, or more exactly Swagger version 2, I think. And it's available over here. No shift. So I mean, it's again just showing off how nice Koha does documentation and everything. It's really, I mean, I said earlier that it has some weirdo, like some strange things for me as a non-Koha developer, but it has a lot of very nice and very cool features. For example, this where you can just inspect the different versions. Oh, do I have internet? I don't know. It doesn't matter. So, but here you see like, and you also maybe see the
development version might be more streamlined.
Okay. Might be more.
Yeah.
Okay, that's even nicer. Okay, so the development version, the newest one is even tidier and nicer. And here you can already see that you have like a lot of different areas, endpoints, and then you can see all of the methods you have here. And as again, because we have this like nice document, it is rendered nicely like this, and you can use it. And I'm not sure if this. I don't have it installed locally, but some of those tools, I didn't have it here. Sorry, this other thing, I didn't start it, but there's this nice thing a lot of those tools have is this try it out feature, where you can just enter some data in here and then actually execute a request, which in that case doesn't work because this thing requests a UID, and SDFS is not the UID, so it says no invalidator and doesn't send the request. But if I would enter UID, it would actually post in the browser whatever payload I specified to this server. You can specify different servers here, like production server, development server, whatever. And then you would get like a response in here, and you can actually play around with the API without using curl. I personally sort of still prefer using curl, but there are people who don't like command line tools and who maybe like Postman. I mean, if you use Postman, for example, you know that. Okay, that's like a web-based, or it's a big user client testing tool thingy, which also, of course, can import OpenAPI specifications, and then you have all of the stuff in Postman already. And also very nice if you're running core testing Docker, it also automatically renders at this slightly weird URL .html. So you can, if you play around with the API, you can actually see what's going on here. It's powered by Modulicious plugin OpenAPI because, as we've already heard, I guess Koha used Modulicious for the API. Yeah, it's on CPAN. So what you need to do if you want to add a new endpoint, there's this, again, nice documentation that basically walks you through it. I'm currently in the process of trying to add a new endpoint to this. So the patch is still not finished. And Mark and me worked on it some time ago, and I see my talk tomorrow on this geo search thing. So here's what I want to do. I want to give a list of biblio numbers. Biblio numbers is like the ID of a book, and return the latitude and the longitude as stored in this mark XML field. Yeah, that's too much bibliographic information for the non-Bible bibliographers, but just some data. So what you need to do is first define the object definitions and paths in the Swagger documentation, and then just implement the action in the Perl code. So Koha has this location file API versus one Swagger paths, where you have a lot of files in there, if you take a look at it. And I'm actually not sure if it's better to add to an existing file or start a new file for a new endpoint. Maybe you can tell me later. We did it like that. So that's one file. Maybe define a GET request with some parameters and what it produces and what the responses are. And the actually interesting thing is this xmojo2 attribute, which is like an extension that's added to this thing by Modulicious. I'm coming to that in a minute. So the next thing you have to do is, because you want to have like one Swagger file which contains all of the things, so you have to load this file into the other file using this thing. So the path we used, which was biblios geo search, whatever, is actually mounted on the public /biblio geo because it's working in the OPAC, in the public path of the thing. And then you have this weird thing which I don't understand. Maybe we're doing it wrong, I don't know. But so what you're doing here is you say, okay, this endpoint, that's a reference. So the schema definition of this endpoint is in another file, in the file path biblios geo search YAML. Fair enough. And yeah, and it's so this sorry, but
I think it's JSON pointer syntax, and it's escaping for slashes and empty strings.
Exactly. I mean, it's definitely escaping for slashes, but I don't understand why we need to escape the slash in here. Or is it necessary, or okay, it's necessary. I figured it's necessary because if you take a look at the Swagger YAML file, you'll see a lot of tilde. But yeah, it's necessary. So it's just like one of those things where I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And then, yeah, okay, just cargo cult it and carry on. Anyway, so this says, okay, take this file, and inside the file, because in one file you could define multiple paths, you can basically link different paths of different files onto different other paths in the global Swagger file. Okay, now you want to implement it in Perl. As I said, so this is like the magic thing, this xmojo2, which is biblios geos and then hash sign and some other thing, which maps this to Koha REST version 1, and then your module name and the method you want to use. And this is how this thing looks like. I'm not sure if I want to. So that, I mean, it's not very complicated. It's just a small file. It's using Mojo-based Modulicious controller because that's what it is. In that case, we're using this Koha Biblios, which is an interface to the DBIC interface to get to the books. This is the method that was linked to the API endpoint. And that's so one of the interesting things. This thing here says, okay, call the OpenAPI schema that somehow via modulus magically map to this endpoint and validate the input. So this checks if all of the data we get matches the JSON specific, the API specification. If it doesn't, we return and then it just aborts. If the input is valid, we can then, on the validation thing, have a set of parameters or whatever, a set of methods to actually get to the data. So all of this code will only run if whatever parameters the user sent actually matches the specification, which is of course nice. Yeah, the rest is some Perl code which takes a billion numbers, goes to the database, fetches some data, blah blah blah. That's not really, I mean, that's just Perl code. And then in the end, you can call render, which renders the results. And the nice thing here, again, implemented by Modulicious, is this OpenAPI thing, which again validates that the data you send out actually matches what you've specified in your schema. There's another method you could just say here, I think JSON, then it would send the payload out without validating it. But the requested way is to use OpenAPI, because then you're like forced to define what your output will be, and it will automatically check if the output matches. So if you call it like that, you get back the data, and yeah, I think, yeah, so okay. A little bit fast. I didn't submit a 1 hour talk, I submitted a 14-minute talk, so it was just got extended to a 1 hour time slot. So the summary, OpenAPI lets you specify and document your API in a machine-readable format that's also readable by humans, which I think is an improvement compared to SOAP. But there are lots of tools to work with the spec, like render the docs, generate the docs, validate the input, validate the output, do a lot of stuff. It can be a bit complex, but I think it's easier if you think about the shape of your API using some common tools before implementing it. Yes, I mean, before I used that, I was just, hacking away code. And then after some time, like a front-end person said, that's stupid, let's change it, or whatever. And using OpenAPI and JSON schema is in fact less work, because you don't have to come up with your own documentation format. Before we used that, it was like, yeah, we were still documenting our APIs, but using some ad hoc weirdo formats which were inconsistent and annoying. Yeah, I already said that. So all involved parties, like the front-end developers, the back-end developers, whoever, can think about, and even using all of those tools, actually play with the API without you having to implement any of it. You only have to implement like this schema specification, but you can gradually build this and make it more and more fine-tuned. I think Koha using OpenAPI Spec is a big improvement over the old days of using CGI scripts. I guess everybody will agree. And I think I think the plan is to move more and more stuff into this Modulicious API. Everything. Okay, so the plan is to move everything from the old code into the Modulicious API, which is great. And it's also saying, again, as a non-Koha developer, much easier, because Modulicious is like a well-known tool, and it's much easier to find people to understand how to use Modulicious than to teach them how to write CGI scripts, which were deprecated 10 years ago. Deprecated, sorry. You still like CGI scripts? Or? Okay, any questions? Yeah, Max and back there, but we start here because the microphone is already here. Okay.
Yeah, regarding the CGI scripts, I think they are called serverless nowadays.
Okay,
but,
of course, yeah, sorry. Yeah, of course. So it's
I've been involved with this for a long time, and I've been meaning to make the move to OpenAPI version 3. We are stuck with version 2. That documentation you showed, actually, it's being compiled into OpenAPI version 3
okay.
For rendering. So in theory, we could do it automatically. One of the constraints we had was the Modulicious plugin not supporting all the things for version 3, specifically JSON validator, which is maintained by the same person.
Okay.
I think the support is now complete, and we could benefit from things you show like polymorphism or responses definitions depending on the content type, etc. These things could be great for us. We actually have very weird under-specified endpoints because we don't have that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and sorry, you don't want to specify mark XML responses.
No, but we want to say yeah. But we have mark XML, and we also have a JSON representation of the bibli object, and we want to specify it. What I wanted to ask, because there are lots of Perl hackers here, is one of the reasons we didn't do it already is because it's a huge task, because the API spec is so big that we cannot think of having a single file for it. It could be cool to try to convert it to version 3, but keeping that modularity we have. Do you think it's doable?
I guess it's doable.
I mean, not manually, like, of course.
Yes, I guess it's doable because I mean I've seen like very big specifications, and actually some of the, I mean, there was this very annoying bug in GitHub, in the GitHub renderer for OpenAPIs for the specifications, where for security reasons they would not longer load external schema specifications. So because they were running the rendering in a sandbox, which doesn't have access to the internet. So a lot of people are complaining because it's still not resolved, that you cannot use external reference schemas, and like the answer from GitHub is then just compile everything into one very big file. So I think that's, I mean, it's doable, definitely. Yeah. But of course, it's a lot of work, and I mean, the advantage is that you already have a machine readable format in using OpenAPI version 2, and yeah. There were some questions back there.
You say you are not using it, but have you tried to generate the test from the specs?
Sorry?
You say you are not using it, but have you tried to generate the test from the spec?
No.
Okay.
Have you? Or? Nope. Okay. I have like another project where we're thinking about it, but we never got around it because it was like a startup hack project where we have like no test at all. Because it was like in an explanatory, what do you call it? It was like in a very early stage, and we just wanted to get something out, but that uses a specification, but just doesn't have any tests yet. So, and the plan was to maybe add tests, but we didn't do it yet. There was one over there. Yeah.
My question actually concerns more the GeoSearch. So, just looking forward for tomorrow's presentation.
Okay.
So I can't say anything about the tests either. We're trying to port our product from 2 to 3, which is a big SaaS product written in Catalyst, but we don't have anything auto-generated at all. So we use Template Toolkit to have various different pieces of YAML that we generate the complete OpenAPI spec out of at runtime when someone asks for it. And that works reasonably well for us. I think it's probably a lot smaller API than this, but it does have a good amount of endpoints and some really weird parameters, and just reusing everything by both reusing obviously pieces of messages in the way you showed is very helpful, but also having a template system to do that. You can just include or like reuse the same block or the same sub template to say this endpoint has all of the standard responses, this endpoint has all of the error responses, that kind of thing. So that's really useful. But yeah, I didn't even know you could make tests at this point.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's like a lot of weird stuff. I mean, okay, we are using Perl, which is famously very weakly typed. But if you use like strong type languages or like Go, I mean, then there are like tools where you can, which auto-generate the API specification from your code. Yes, so if you're using a strongly typed language with very strict definitions of the input and output of each function,
You're getting dangerously close to SOAP now.
Yeah, but again, people are doing it. It's like the other way around. Generate the specification from the code. But, oh, my computer fell asleep.
Well, I might ask about, like security. I mean, there's like different authorization methods, but what if you have like a public endpoint that takes like one integer and you're trying to fit a novel into the query and try to, rust the server?
Okay.
Is there some kind of a intellectual thing going on in the background, or is it just about authorization to limit the access?
Okay, so that's like so for authorization there are tools, and so your question is how can you prevent like basically a too big request?
Yeah.
That I think that's not part of the specification. So in the specification you say, okay, we have an integer and that's max or it's a big int and has that value, and if a user sends you like huge amounts of data, it's against the specification. But of course you cannot prevent the user from sending whatever they want, and I think it will probably be again still your job in your code to defend against this. But regarding authentication and authorization, there are also very nice tools in the in the OpenAPI specification in this trying things out thing, where you can actually authenticate. Okay, this is a stupid API because it's not. Does it have it? No. Okay, I don't have one open at the moment. But you can actually in the specification say, okay, this endpoint needs basic authentication or needs a bearer token or whatever. And then you can also, via some special objects, specify whatever that is. And then in this trying things out, people could actually log in, get a token, and then you can add the token and stuff like that. So you can also document the authentication methods that are needed in here. But maybe there are tools that then automatically generate code for you that check this authentication, but I'm not using them because I rather write my own code than have it auto-generated. Great. Any more questions or comments or whatever? Or discussion?
I just wanted to mention that we already mentioned we use DBIC.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, we have our Koha objects classes. And we also have a wrapper and a couple helpers that would make your code much simpler.
Okay.
Because, we basically have a query parameter named Q,
okay.
Which can take a DBIC query.
Yep.
That gets translated all the layers down, and it will handle pagination,
okay.
All the headers about the totals.
Okay, so we don't need to implement a custom endpoint for it. Is what you're saying?
You don't.
Okay, nice.
Less code. All you need to do is add a method to the biblio class,
yep.
in which you name coordinates,
yeah,
for example,
okay. Yep.
that will return the right thing, and you will add to the spec an embed,
okay.
which will make it
okay.
work.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool, great. I'll maybe ask you about that later. So you're sort of implementing. So you're allowing, you have an endpoint which can basically take DBIX class thing. So it's like a little bit like GraphQL, if you know that. GraphQL. Yeah. No, but okay. Sorry.
You're talking about a different
specification
language.
That's a totally different thing.
We
yes,
didn't
yes.
pick that one.
No,
that's worth mentioning. We picked OpenAPI over RAML
Mhm.
in an internal discussion we had in 2015, I think, because it used there was a plugin for module issues.
Okay.
That's how we picked it.
Okay.
And GraphQL came a year later
Yeah,
or
then
something.
it's-
So we did what we could with that.
Cool.
What I was saying is these embeds and joins can be triggered from the API
Okay.
spec.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's-
Because I mean, the Koha, the database Koha was very bad in that. I actually have it to do in my, which I removed from the slides because I didn't want to. Yeah, because it's using one query for each row, which is completely stupid, obviously. Okay. Oh, great. Then thanks and okay.